All right. We're gonna see if this works out. Says that I'm live. How do I go to the live stream? Freak is here. Or Freck. Frake? Maybe it was Frake. Hopefully I'm saying it right. Okay. Let's see. Seems like my internet connection is super lame. We got a bad. I'm not sure if it's buffering. I know that the video size is like well off. Let's see. How is it looking? Whoops. On everyone else's side. I think my settings were like, I set it up for 1080, but it's really 720, which is why the screen's getting cut. If it seems like it's okay, we'll hobble through it. If you all can kind of let me know if it's not buffering, and I'll just kind of try to control the screen size where, even though I'm really supposed to be full screen here, it looks like it's kind of getting cut off in the upper quadrant. So people say it's okay. All right, I'll just make sure to kind of use a really large font size, and then we'll kind of just go from there. So I'm actually going to close the browser here just to kind of save on some bandwidth, but I'll bring it back up here in a few minutes. So let's see here. Let me bring up the example. Well, first of all, let's reset everything. So basically, we'll wait just a minute here. Let me get the font size all cleaned up. I think that's about as large as the screen as you all are seeing. But let's bump up that font size a whole lot. So let's go to like at least 20. That's hopefully okay on 720. Again, if it's not, don't worry. I'm going to probably clean up this and turn it into kind of one of the more formal videos that are part of the BaseCode subscription, or BaseCode channel, or whatever that's called on YouTube. But basically, at least for now, we can kind of go through this together. The goal here is really just to do about 15 minutes in here, 10 or 15 minutes in here, just kind of get the ball rolling. And then I'll jump back on YouTube and kind of look at that chat channel and see if anybody has any questions. So if you have questions as we're going through or want me to kind of revisit something, just go ahead and post your question right away. And then, like I said, I can review those. Or if you have a question in general, feel free to just post in that channel and I'll kind of just go back in there and catch up in just a minute. So I'm going to assume that the streaming is going to be able to keep up with me. I'm getting the little red up here from OBS, but I'm just going to keep kind of powering through. And again, if it doesn't hold up, I'll try to use a stronger internet connection in the future. Maybe record it from work or something. So, all right. So this code actually came from the Oh Dear app, which is something that what was it? Spatie made. They make a lot of Laravel packages, but this is actually one of their SaaS products. It does uptime checking for websites, services, and it seems like they're actually expanding on their services more than just kind of the basic is the site up. They're going to start adding some more features, which is pretty cool. But this particular piece of code is actually pretty clean already. It follows a lot of kind of the early practices that I talk about in BaseCode, like formatting, has some great naming. There's not a whole lot of nested code. The blocks are pretty condensed. So it's really following a lot of the things that we've talked about in some of the videos and a lot of those kind of simpler practices that you can implement right away, right? But what I want to kind of look at here, as I think there's always improvement and opportunity to improve some code, what I want to look at here is maybe kind of the next set of practices in BaseCode that I'm going to be working on here over the next few weeks. So still trying to get that early edition out where we'll cover kind of the first 5, and then the next 5 I basically want to cover, start kind of doing videos, and that was kind of the reasoning behind doing this live stream. I think they actually had those line breaks in there. So, but anyways, let's jump right in here. This is the check model. It's a Laravel app. So, but inside of it, what I want to focus on is this needs to run method. This needs to run method, I guess, is called to determine if when they get ready to check one of these sites or services, that they basically call this to determine, hey, should we run this check right now, or is everything okay? And then we'll run the check again here in a little bit. So again, pretty clean code, nice simple if blocks here. Nothing's nested, and it gets down here to the bottom, so we can see what we've talked about as guard clauses before. Some good naming. This check needs to run. Does the check need to run? We can see that it returns a bool, so it's got a nice, clean, human-readable name. As do a lot of these other things. Has active subscription, get the latest run, has it failed, previous run has crashed, things of that nature. So really clean code. And again, when Frake shared this, I thought it was pretty clean already, but one of the focuses I wanted to kind of give it, or one of the practices that I wanted to try to apply to it, just for even, purposes of the book or kind of working through my own thoughts and how I want to share that with the audience, is symmetry. So it's one of the later practices, and honestly, this is definitely one of the more artistic sides of programming, right? It takes a pretty long time to kind of determine what symmetry is or looks like in your code, mainly because symmetry is very relative. It's relative all the way down to the method. It's relative project to project. It's relative to your team. What's symmetrical maybe at one job or team that you work on might not be something that people agree are symmetrical. So it is one of those more subjective things, and as such, it's a little hard to kind of pinpoint. But I think because this code's already in a nice place, it's something that we can kind of quickly focus on. So I want to give it mostly focus on symmetry again for those first 10 minutes, but let's take an opportunity just to give this like a first pass and see if there's anything that we can do in kind of the formatting and the naming, or any kind of quick cleanups that we could do right away. So again, hopefully my stream's running. All right, good. So we have, let's spend just a few minutes and take a first pass here. So we talked about these guard clauses already. We can see things like this has subscription or generic trial. That seems fine. It's all named pretty well. We have a little bit more complex of a statement here than kind of the previous ones, right? There's this optional that's being used, which is actually a really cool helper inside of Laravel. It basically wraps whatever you have inside of a null object, so you can actually chain things on it later and don't have to worry that you're going to get like a PHP exception. So normally, for example, if latest run returned null and then you tried to change the method call to has failed on it and that returned null, that would be a problem. But if you wrap it in this optional, has failed just ends up returning null, and you don't get any kind of exception thrown by PHP because of this wrapping that happens inside of it. What's interesting though is that they check is null on latest run immediately following. So that's, I think, an opportunity for improvement. We'll come back to that in just a second. There's another thing as far as naming that I would actually kind of clean up here. Most of these are really, really good, so it's a great start. But I think a common tendency in naming, especially naming Boolean methods, is to kind of overuse that prefix of is or has. You can maintain all the same readability without having to always kind of force yourself to inject that question type statement in front of it, or kind of prefix it with certain words like has or is or was. So for example, this previous run has crashed. We didn't use like has previous run crashed there. We kind of injected has a little bit later. But the point is that, for example, we can still take out that has a lot of times and get the same thing we want. So previous run crashed. Has failed could maybe be just failed, right? We're already in the context of the latest run. So did the latest run fail, or did it failed, or whatever you want to call it? So if it reads okay to you, that's fine. But I think there's just some opportunity to see what it looks like without the has. So in this example, right, maybe instead of has ended more than 5 minutes ago, we just do ended more than 5 minutes ago, right? Check has already been scheduled or is running. We could do something along the lines of, already scheduled or is running, right? So again, pretty straightforward, just really small things we can do to just tweak that wording just a little bit, right? Up here, we could do the active subscription or is generic trial. I think the has here is okay, just again, because it kind of lends to that Boolean value. So sometimes you can do it, sometimes you can't, but it's a small little thing we can do to clean up some of that wording. I might even go so far as actually on a separate note to change latest run to just last run. I'm not sure if there's a difference in their domain logic between the latest run and the last run. I don't know why there would be based on the wording alone, but that could be something else you could do. You could change this to just last run. So just a quick pass again to see if we can tweak that naming. And that's something you kind of almost always want to do in the code. Even if you feel like you have a really good naming, just double check it, see if it reads well, right? See if you can maybe make it, you know, a little more verbose, a little more human readable. Sometimes human readable actually means that it's shorter. We're dropping out some of those buffer words, right? So this was a really good example here, again, with the, instead of has already been scheduled or is running, already scheduled or is running is a little more succinct, right? The next thing I want to do, again, kind of all lending towards that symmetry, is that I'm noticing that the checks here for return false and return true aren't necessarily symmetrical in the way that they're grouped. They're kind of zigzaggy, right? So you can get a false up here, but you can also see that there's a false that ends up being returned down here. There's some trues in the middle. You know, I'm not sure why this maybe needs to be down here. There could be a reason for that. But if there isn't, I really would like to see some symmetry in the fact that I'm initially reading all of the false statements and then I'm reading all of the true statements. So again, a small little bit of symmetry there just to kind of clean up that code. I also want symmetry in the statements themselves. So if you look at symmetry from the perspective of, you know, naming, look at symmetry in perspective of the structure of the code. So true being like all down here, all the falses being up here, but also just in the way that we're kind of making calls, right? So a lot of these are calling out to other methods, but some of them aren't. So we see that this is kind of just an inline check. It's not necessarily symmetrical with these method calls that we're seeing kind of everywhere else. So maybe there's something we can do there. This is kind of an inline, you know, local thing that's being done there, and then we're knotting that. So there's arguably, again, it's not symmetrical. That also kind of lets us see that maybe this is relatively complex. Maybe this could be better performed as example, this dot is disabled, right? We would gain that symmetry of being a nice readable method name similar to these other ones, but we also get rid of that kind of minor complexity that was not enabled. So this just reads a little better. It's still performing the same action. We already have tons of little helper methods on this class. I'm sure that those are probably private. What's the big deal to add one more if we're gaining that much more clarity? The other thing as far as symmetry is there might be symmetry in performance. I would imagine that this needs to run, probably runs every minute for lots and lots of sites. So maybe it's something that we might want to actually have some symmetry in, like checking the simplest things first and then working our way up to the harder things, right? So there's some flow and some symmetry that could happen there. So maybe this is disabled check is very, very simple to do, right? Oh, I've entered some kind of weird mode there. There we go. So maybe we just want to put that up top. Maybe there's no database calls or anything like that, so it's super simple. Down here we can kind of see the same thing. We're checking this is null on last run. Not only are we wrapping this with a little bit of complexity and kind of have that negated value that's going on, but it also would actually remove this optional check if we did this a little earlier. So we could do something like that, and now we could actually get rid of this optional, because the only way the code would ever pass farther down here is to ensure that last run was not null. And if it's not null, then we don't need to worry about this optional check. So again, as cool as that helper is, there actually wasn't a need to use it if we just kind of looked and analyzed the code for some symmetry. I also think there's an opportunity to maybe change this name so we don't have this complex is null. We could actually just say something, again, just kind of flip this on its head and give it a cooler name, like is first run, right? So if it's this checks first run, then yeah, we need to run it. So again, just a small way to kind of tweak that wording. And all this is just giving it one more pass, right? It's great code to begin with, but maybe we can make it just slightly better and kind of challenge ourselves in different ways. And one of these ways is symmetry. So I think we can move on from here for a second. Again, there might be an opportunity, maybe this previous run crashed is something that's a lot easier to check, so maybe that can go higher up. Maybe it needs to belong lower. So just little checks like that that we can do. So we can talk more about these in a second. The next thing I want to focus on for symmetry is also kind of, again, addressing calls like this. And this kind of puts us on another path that I want to talk about, which is not actually in BaseCode, but I'm strongly considering adding it as the 11th practice. I'm really trying to make all the practices, any kind of discipline or practice that you might want to apply to code, somehow link back to one of the core practices in BaseCode. I mean, hence the name, right? These are base practices. These are the very fundamental things, and kind of everything else stems from here. And I'm not sure if, in this case, feature envy, which is one of the core kind of code smells inside of programming, is covered. And so let's talk a little bit about that. There's some things that go underneath feature envy. And what we're really getting at with feature envy are checks like this. And the reason I would call this feature envy, or more specifically, inappropriate intimacy, is that all of these things are concerned with the type. And if we get down to minutes between runs, we can actually see this a lot more, right? We can see that there's just all these checks inside of the check class. Again, not to be confused. So there's all these conditions inside of the check class that deal with type, right? And even though there's these great constants, and this is very common code, there's just it seems like this class, or this method specifically, is very interested in types, right? It's not as interested in the check itself, but the type of check that's being performed. And because of that, I think there's an opportunity to maybe clean up this code as well. So that's kind of the last thing I want to look at. And in turn, it kind of comes back to symmetry. So we have all these nice tight tests here that are just these simple method calls, very readable names, very nice, very symmetrical code structure. But then we kind of get to this guy that maybe has arguably a little more complexity, relatively speaking, right? It has a double check, right? A double condition, or a compound conditional. And then same thing down here. We kind of see that same code. So maybe there's an opportunity to do something with this. I want to get to questions, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think this is something I'll cover in a future video. But let me just write what I would like to see this code as, and we can kind of maybe have a discussion about what we think about it. So instead of maybe this thing performing the checks itself, we clearly already have this check type class. I'd rather delegate to it and not have to leak kind of this information on what type means, and potentially even what it means to have, how long those runs are supposed to be. So maybe I would rather see something along the lines, just for starters, of like, I'm not sure. Let's see. Let's just say something simple like is mixed content, and we would pass it this type, right? So it's just a static method, super easy to test, very easy to call. It has no state. It's very functional, right? And then we could just as easily do this, right? And it gets rid of this kind of lower level code. I think we could argue, maybe we could all agree that this code's pretty low level compared to this. I know it's just a delegate method and we're kind of just pushing that code somewhere else, but I don't know, it looks a little cleaner to me. It's something to try out. Again, I haven't formulated that chapter just yet, but I think it'd be a good discussion point. So that could be an option. So we'll just kind of leave this as, what do we think? Whoops, think. The last thing I want to end on is anytime I ever see these kind of things, I still consider this a magic, kind of a magic number, if you will. These other ones are okay, right? I wouldn't go so far as to do something like, 5 minutes. That starts to be a little bit silly, right? I think the 5 is okay. But what's interesting to me is when I see this, my brain, at least just me, went to kind of seconds. And that was very strange because it's like, well, why am I returning 5 minutes down here? But then why am I like, multiplying these seconds out? I would have expected, I guess, from this method just to see something like 12. just from a readability perspective. Just that's where my brain went. I'm not sure if other people think that, but I don't know, maybe something even just switching that around could help. But if this is something that happens a lot in the code base, I'd probably consider making some kind of time helper or extending Carbon, because I know that Laravel uses Carbon. But if we had some kind of like time object, it'd be really cool in Ruby if we could, do something like 13.minutes, right? That's just not us in PHP, but we could mimic that behavior by maybe doing something like, you know, hours in minutes and then passing it 12. Again, just something that's a little more readable. Maybe has other places in the code that could be used. If this is the only place that we're doing, 60 times 12, I can live with it. But just this conversation starter of what do we think about kind of improving readability here, getting rid of this low-level check by introducing kind of these different objects or pushing this code somewhere else so we're not necessarily doing it in check. Simply because I don't believe check should be responsible for minute calculations. It shouldn't necessarily be responsible for kind of this intimate knowledge of what it means to be a broken links type check, even though this is pretty standard programming practice. It's just kind of littered throughout here, and maybe this just reads a little better and is a better place to put that code. Very similar to feature envy is also this method chaining. So we can also see this another place here is this site team has active subscription trial. That's a little bit deep, right? We really, check now needs to know that, it's fine that it knows that it has a site. That's kind of its sub-dependency. But knowing that site also has a team starts to get, again, a little bit inappropriate as far as how deep it's supposed to know. What if this became groups someday or something else? And while I don't necessarily like to speculate, that does stick out at me as another one of those examples of I'm a little bit more concerned with the code that's deeper than maybe I should be. Maybe we could just roll this up a little bit higher, and that way site is a little more knowledgeable. And even though it's just delegating that down to team, or maybe it's doing the logic right there, we'd have to look at this method to know for sure what we could do. But at least we're sticking with that symmetry of only calling our dependencies and not necessarily our dependencies, because that would increase coupling. So a lot of information there in the last bit. I'm definitely going to clean that up and probably we'll do another talk on that. But I think we had some ideas here, definitely for sure. So again, just a first pass for kind of how we can invert some naming, clean it up. We can drop some of those extra uses of has. Again, they make sense in some spots to kind of denote that, Boolean method. They read pretty well, but sometimes they read a little technical. We don't need to follow Java, necessarily the practice of always having is or has in front of it. Some of them are human readable enough to understand that that would be a Boolean return. Already scheduled or is running. Previous run crashed. So a little bit of cleanup there. I'd like to bring up this code side by side, but let's jump to Chrome and just see what kind of questions we have, or if we're even still streaming at this point. Let's see what we have down here. Are we still running or did we die? About to find out. Bad. Uh-oh. Okay, people are down here. Get that horrible code out of my eyes. Okay. Did we work? Okay. How are we doing? Okay, so we got a few questions in here. Let me catch up. I'm going to turn my sound off just so I don't hear myself talking. Okay, cool. Great. Excellent questions here. All right, so let's do this. Let me catch up here. All right, so Frake's making fun of his own code. Thank you. Yes, so it looks 37 million times. So, this is one of those examples where definitely at 37 million times, you might want to actually give some symmetry as far as performance might be concerned, right? Do your simplest checks first and then move down. So, are constants in check type database IDs? I would imagine that they are. I'm sure Frake could talk about that or answer that specifically. But oh, nope, he did answer it. Thank you. Okay, so it is just a string. All right, cool. So these are just simple type checks. So definitely the constant is a great start, but it's something where, having this mixed content maybe just abstracts that a little bit farther, so we don't need to worry about it so much. Let's see, generally speaking, I don't like switch statements. That's fair. I do like the if statements here. I think you could easily, some people would think to maybe make this all one compound return. So, return this disabled, and then or, not has subscription, and just kind of keep going from there and there. I don't find that readable. Not only from a human perspective, but I also don't think it's very readable from even the compiler perspective. What I'm really saying there is that if you got into a place where you were debugging this long single line, even if you broke it up with some formatting, could be a little bit challenging. So having this nice separation here is actually nice, not only from a human perspective, but also, I think from a debugger/computer's perspective. Okay, why do check type versus this is mixed content? That's a good question. So here, so the question is mixed content. If we did it here, we're inside of the check model. So we would really just be wrapping this to be a delegation call to outside to check type. So I'm not sure where that really gets us. That would really just get us to where we had this private method here of is mixed content, mixed content, and then we pass in this type, or well, we wouldn't pass in the type here, but here we would actually then perform the delegation of going to kind of the next thing. Somewhere I have a bad syntax. Oh, private function, that helps. So if we do this, we would really end up just kind of doing this check here, which that's really just kind of cost without benefit in my mind. We're just kind of kicking it down a little bit farther, and then we're passing it and delegating it along here. So I'm not sure what that gets us here. If we did the same, like this same check down here, I think it starts to get, again, the situation where what have we really gained? I would just leave it like this at that point if we're just bouncing this down within this class lower and lower and lower. I'm not too sure if there's enough of a gain there, is what I'm getting at. Okay, so return time 1 hour. You could just have another constant there. This is kind of, it doesn't scale well. It's kind of never ending, right? So now you have 1 hour and 2 hours and 3 hours and 4 hours. So this time helper can still have that calculation inside of it where it just takes whatever the argument is and multiplies it by 60. So it's very dynamic, but it gives us just that little bit more readability that we would expect to see here. I have to kind of remind myself when I look at 60 times 12 that we're talking about minutes here and not seconds or something else. It's not as clean as these other ones where it's just like 5 minutes, 3 minutes. It's just a very simple return type. So if I did have something where it was like hours and minutes, 12 hours, I know I'm getting this result as minutes, which matches up here in my mind. Not everybody might agree that that's readable. Again, that's that practice of naming things is hard and also the symmetry of it. What else here? I'll take a few more. Would you recommend always keeping those types of methods in the model? For example, if you had a service layer where your logic was, would you still keep all your checks and get methods in the model? Probably not. I don't think that it makes as much sense once you introduce this service layer. I think for now I didn't want to get into a place where I was changing where things were located as far as this particular entire needs to run, but I could definitely see this method existing at a higher level. So the model's a little bit of a low level. Some kind of service layer would obviously be a higher layer than that, and so maybe it makes a little bit more sense for it to live there. But since it's not introduced, I wouldn't want to make that leap until there was an absolute reason to hold other types of logic. I wouldn't just break that out here strictly to have a service layer, if you will. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, ask again. So time.hours12.endminutes. Yeah, that's a really nice one. So yeah, you could move the entire minutes over there. In fact, at first I was kind of thinking when you see a bunch of if statements tight like this, even though I guess Frake was saying that he doesn't necessarily like a switch statement, this is really just a switch statement. We can think of this like switch and then basically this type. Whoops. I can learn to type. There we go. We can basically think of it like that, and then the cases are all the different check type and then broken links, for example, right? And I think he said those were strings, but I just made them numbers for now. I didn't have that code. And then here we would return 60 times 12, right? And we would just keep going on and on and on and checking each one of these. When you see it like this, it's a lot more clear the refactor that needs to happen, right? When you start to see a switch statement with multiple checks that deal with another class, but we're in the check model instead of the check type model, we start to see how it makes sense to kind of refactor this, because that's a very common refactor. In this case, it would be refactor, switch with polymorphism. So maybe if we had a class for each one of these check types, we had a broken link check type, we had a, an uptime check type, we had a certificate health check type. Again, that's probably going a little bit too far. I don't like introducing objects until they kind of have a natural need. That's the whole Yagni in me, the you aren't going to need it. I don't think we need polymorphism just yet. So I think for now, my first step would be to just take this abstraction, take this intimacy that's happening here and potentially even up here, move it to check type, give it some time, see how it feels over there. If you're still doing other things with check type or the different check types in there over and over and over again in each one of those methods, then maybe it would be time to introduce some type of polymorphism with check type. And you could do some object or some model attribute casting inside of Laravel to actually make that one of those immutable types. So that would be pretty interesting. That would be very object oriented. I don't think we need to get there today. But to Frake's point, we could have this simply be, check type, minutes between run, you could even say, for type if you want. But I think it's okay without it. And then here you would just pass in this type. And basically this entire method as it existed previously without what we did here. So make that check back to where it was, everything was just type. You would basically just take this and move it directly to check type. So that was something that Frake, I think, was suggesting in the comments. So it is something you could do. Okay. I think, any other questions? Yeah, hours, 12 to minutes. All of these would be basically up to you and what your code base looks like. You would want to make this symmetrical, with the code that exists. So if you already have something that's a little more chainable, that's something you would want to follow. That's entirely up to you and your code base. Can't see the bottom of the file. Uh-oh. I'm not sure exactly where it's cut off. So I'm sorry about that. I kind of changed the settings last minute. I'll just kind of pop this up here for a second. I changed from 1080 because of my internet connection to 720, so my screen size changed without me being able to kind of change it on the fly, so I just kind of guessed. So I apologize for that. Again, I'm going to clean this video up and do kind of a proper one, and hopefully later today, and I'll have that released tomorrow for everyone to check out. But the questions probably won't be in that. That was kind of exclusive for you all, so I appreciate you all attending. I hope that we got something out of it. Definitely email me if I missed your question in here. If you have your own suggestions as well, definitely comment on the video tomorrow. Like I said, I'm going to give this another recording and a pass here in just a bit. So, okay, great. So yeah, Frake, so thanks to Frake and the Oh Dear app and the Spatie team for sharing this code, being brave enough to put that out there. Hopefully they had some ideas that came from this. So Frake, if you do change the code up in any way, I'll definitely, again, share this video tomorrow and maybe post the gist. But if you end up taking some of the practices from here, hopefully you can share that with the rest of the gang. So, all right, y'all. Thanks a lot. See you later.